Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about names that our ancestors used to name their children, and what names did they give to their children. Investigating these very personal acts is one of the important clues that our ancestors left us about themselves and about their culture. And I hope to give you some methods for understanding the use of names and naming patterns where they exist, because when used cautiously, they can sometimes help us in a variety of ways with our research. What is a name, or what's in a name? The decision that a parent made to give a particular name to their child is, as I said, a very personal act and often is embedded with all sorts of connotations. Names can reflect tradition in a family. A child can be named for an earlier relative, a grandparent, a great-grandparent, a sibling who died, or a close family friend whom the birth parent wished to honor. Names can reflect social norms and cultural influences depending on what exactly prevailed in the culture of the parents at the time of the birth. If it was common to name children using naming customs of a foreign culture, and then the family moved to America, those same cultural forces may or may not be maintained when they made their trip to the new country. They may have tried to assimilate into America and left all of the old world customs behind them. The reasons behind whether they were maintained or abandoned will be discussed. Names can most certainly reflect the influence of religious traditions. If your ancestors attended a particular church or belonged to a certain denomination, there may have been strong religious forces that influenced their decisions to give a child a particular name. Similarly, there might be some prevailing cultural interest or trend. A child may be named for someone important in history of a country, a king, a president, a general, a national hero. Over time, many families lost traditional influences and chose names for their children based on cultural trends and what was fashionable at the time. That was certainly true in America by the second half of the 19th century, when the names of popular figures, literary characters, and names considered trendy became popular. You may find virtue names among your Puritan and Quaker ancestors, like patience and charity, which exemplified religious and civic virtues that the parents valued. There were names that parents made up just for the sake of it. They were quirky, and there was no particular significance to it other than it was popular. Like, for example, Frank Zappa named his daughter Moon Unit Zappa in the 1960s. It was trendy or just avant-garde and eccentric. And then a name may just be a name like John and Mary that was named just for the sake of it because it was easy to remember and had no particular significance at all. So it's hard to get inside the minds of our ancestors, but we can sometimes try if our reasoning is imperfect. So let's try the next slide. Studying names is essential to the historical interpretation of a family. And as I said, the historian Daniel Scott Smith has written, quote, "The naming of children was never a trivial act," end quote. It gives us, as researchers, one chance to get to know our ancestors better. If a naming pattern involves perpetuating or honoring earlier generations, such as grandparents, then the use of those names can be really valuable as clues for those earlier generations, and especially when we may be facing a brick wall. The names of children may also help us distinguish two people of the same name living in the same area, or resolve conflicts when a mother can be placed in two different birth families. We have to be very careful when we're looking for naming patterns. We don't want to overemphasize what we find or reach the wrong conclusion. We need to study very closely the cultural mores, the cultural milieu of the time and the area where the ancestor lived. Then we ask ourselves, what were other people doing at that time? If a certain prevailing custom existed, did our ancestors follow it in choosing the names for their children? Even when there was a strong social custom, it is always possible that an ancestor deviated from that custom. We can never be completely certain. However, we may be able to discern a pattern from other names when we are looking for additional evidence. Okay. In Western European culture, children traditionally received their official name at the time of their baptism. This was especially true for both Catholics and certain Protestant churches that practiced infant baptism. Sometimes baptism occurred very close to the date that a child was born. There was a prevailing belief that at a time of high infant mortality, a child would go to hell if it was not baptized. As time wore on, especially as some cultures in the 19th century changed, a greater interval happened between the date of birth and the date of baptism. Sometimes children were not named right away after their birth. When mortality was high and infant baptism was not practiced, it was easier for the parents if the baby died without a formal name. And sometimes you'll notice on census records, very young children less than a year old living with no name being recorded, only baby or baby girl or baby boy. Uh, if parents waited a few months before establishing a strong bond with their infant, it was easier emotionally if the child died. And sometimes that bonding was inevitable, but just be aware of that sometimes you'll see that in records. Let's begin our study looking at patterns in the British Isles. England has some of the oldest records in Europe, and there are records of baptisms from some churches dating back to the 16th century. Historians have undertaken formal academic studies in an attempt to discern naming patterns from these records. An historian named Scott Smith Bannister, in his book, Names and Naming Patterns in England, 1538 to 1700, states that the evidence from these early registers before 1600 shows that children were often given the names of godparents who witnessed the baptisms. Godparents played an important role across Europe. If a child's parents died, the godparents would often assume responsibility for raising the orphan. Sometimes they were relatives or close friends of the parents. We will see later when we look at Germany and America, these godparents were given a chance to name the child, and often they named it after themselves. In the town of Banbury, Oxfordshire, 86% of the children baptized in the 1550s received names of their godparents. Of course, this custom might have differed in other parts of England, and there's been no system-wide study of all the parish registers in England. We have this snapshot, and historians have projected that snapshot on the culture. During the English civil wars of the 1640s and 1650s, when Oliver Cromwell deposed King Charles I and put his Puritan government in place, the Church of England was disestablished, and the practice of using godparents at baptism was banned. The same also held true in colonial New England, which was heavily influenced by Cromwellian Puritan customs. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, the Church of England was reestablished and the custom of godparents returned, but the custom of naming children after godparents had declined by that date. Even before Cromwell, naming patterns in England began to change in the 17th century. It became common to name children after their grandparents, aunts, and uncles, and other people in a family. The pattern had a number of slight variants, but it came to prevail in Scotland and Ireland, as we shall see. The pattern goes like this. The eldest son was named for the father's father, the second son for the mother's father, the third son for the father, the fourth son for the eldest paternal uncle. This was the English pattern. The eldest daughter, usually for the mother's mother, the second daughter for the father's mother, the third daughter for the mother, the fourth daughter for the eldest maternal aunt. But it was not universally used, and it has to be applied cautiously. Sometimes the father's mother, for example, might be named for the eldest daughter, the eldest daughter might be named for, rather than the other way around. So there are a number of factors, and if a mother's father was particularly close to a family, it's possible that father might be the first one named. So there's all kinds of possibilities in flux here. You have to be very careful. While the eldest son was quite often the father's father, there were other influences that could certainly play into the whole process. Other naming patterns were also at play at this time. The grandparent naming system was used. Naming a child after the reigning monarch or a very popular early monarch was popular. During the 18th century, you will see lots of children named George, named after one of the kings, George I, George II, George III, even if George did not run in the family of the person giving the child. You will occasionally find names such as Richard and Arthur, which are historical names in English history, King Arthur being very popular. Biblical names were also popular, especially among Puritans and later among Baptists and other evangelical Christians. Old Testament prophets and patriarchs such as Moses, Ezekiel, Abraham, and Noah were used much more frequently as first names beginning in the 1600s. Finding such a name in a family may indicate that it was very religious, but it does not necessarily indicate the name of an earlier relative. David Hackett Fisher, in his book Albion's Seed, states that in 17th century Boston, 90% of all names were taken from the Bible. In Hingham, in Plymouth Colony, that number was as high as 95%. 50% of all girls were either named Mary, Elizabeth, or Sarah. Rebecca was also popular, as were Anne, Hannah, Deborah, Huldah, Abigail, Rachel, and Ruth. Of boys' names, the most common were John, Joseph, Samuel, and Josiah. Some names were considered taboo, such as Jesus, Angel, and Emmanuel. We already have talked about the popularity of virtue names, and I will say more about those in a moment. They were related to names for biblical figures because they represented religious virtues that were prized by the parents. I have an ancestor named Solomon Stanley, who was kicked out of his Puritan or his Quaker meeting in Hanover County, Virginia in 1776 for marrying a woman who was not a Quaker. The members of the Cedar Creek meeting wrote that he had married out of unity. One of his daughters was named Unity, and the other was named Charity, and perhaps there was some deeper meaning to these names because of his situation. Some families practice the tradition of replacement names, or what we call necronyms. If a child died, a later child would be given the name of the earlier deceased one. If a family followed this custom, it will throw the whole generational naming pattern completely out of whack. The practice was also very popular in Puritan New England. Finally, you may find last names being used as first names. This custom was very popular in the American South from about the Revolutionary War era until well into the 20th century. You'll also see it to some extent in the British Isles. It was a way to honor the maiden name of the mother or a paternal or maternal grandmother. Whenever you see an unusual name among a group of children, a name that sounds like it's a last name, you should take it very seriously as a genealogist and try to determine where the name came from. Was it a family member? Was it a neighbor? A clergyman? It may be really useful as a clue about the extended family members. And again, be careful because we may be honoring a family friend instead of a family name. The patriarchal naming pattern was also very popular in Ireland and Scotland, as it was in England, and even probably more so. And you see it very strongly among the Irish and Scots-Irish settlers in the 18th century in America. As before, the pattern goes eldest son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, third son for the father, eldest daughter for either the father's mother or the mother's mother, and then the second daughter for the reverse, whichever the other one was, and the third daughter for the mother. The most common boys' names among Scots-Irish were John, James, William, Alexander, and Robert. By the third quarter of the 18th century, you will sometimes see middle names being used to honor earlier family members. An eldest daughter, for example, may not only have her maternal grandmother's first name, but also her maiden name as a middle name. When this happens, you actually find a written record of a full name, it can be a great clue for more information. The challenge in reconstructing these naming patterns often involves gathering a complete list of the children. Not all of them may appear in baptismal church records. The oldest surviving son in a family may not necessarily be the oldest son. The one with the father's name may have died young without any record. The Scots-Irish in the American frontier continued to perpetuate this pattern at least into the 18th century, but it began to evolve and disappear by the 19th. There was a strong interest in a great variety of names, including Celtic names such as Ewan and Owen, and names after border places such as Ross or Clyde, and names of saints such as Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, or Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, or David, the patron saint of Wales. There was also a spirit of what David Hackett Fisher calls onomastic individualism. These names were rare and sometimes invented by the parents or chosen from obscure origins. The Irish pattern is similar. The eldest son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, third son after other relatives, not necessarily the father. Eldest daughter for the father's mother, second daughter for the mother's mother, third daughter for other relatives. Rosemary Folliott, the longtime editor of the Irish Genealogist, stated her opinion after many years of research. She was the foremost researcher of 18th century Ireland, said that it was almost universal throughout Ireland in the 18th century to name the eldest son for the father's father. However, whether the eldest daughter was named for the father's mother or the mother's mother was commonly alternated and cannot be relied upon genealogically. So I want to show up the example from my own genealogy of this practice in play. My ancestor, James Beatty, was from Ireland. He was originally from the north in County Down, moved down to County Wexford into the village of Ballycanoe in the early 1770s, where he had a mill. We have his Bible actually was copied by his son, and it gives us the names of 7 children: James, Leonard, John, Elizabeth, Susanna, Dempster, and Anne. So what do we know about this? And certainly Dempster jumps out at us right away as a really unusual name, not a common name that you'd think of as a regular name of a child. So it might be a last name being used as a first name. So we want to look a little bit further. The eldest son is named James. It's not likely the custom that the father would name his eldest son after himself. Sometimes that coincided that way. But what if James had been the 3rd son of his father, which is actually the case? We see then that James was the name of the grandfather, and so that James, the father, was James Jr. So the eldest son was actually James III. So it can get complicated like that. The 2nd son was definitely Leonard, after Anne's father, because we know there was a Leonard Bennett living in Ballycanoe at the right time. He was an older man, the right age to be Anne's father. So we know that Leonard comes from there. We're still not sure from other records, and I've tried to figure this out for years, whether the 2 eldest daughters, Elizabeth and Susanna, were the names of which of the 2. Was Elizabeth James's mother, or was it Anne's mother? And was Susanna the other way around? We don't really know because we haven't found any records, but we know for pretty sure, we're pretty confident that those are the 2 grandmothers. We just don't know how to assign them because the 3rd daughter was named Anne after her mother. So what about Dempster? And this becomes really interesting. And I'll show you some examples of documents you can uncover to help unpuzzle this. This is a vestry book from the little village of Ballycanoe, showing my great-great-great-grandfather as the church warden in 1779. There's his signature in the book. And down very at the bottom, who was also a signature, was Leonard Bennett, who was the father-in-law, who was signing on in the church book. So that's an example of how you can find a record that gives you a clue like this. You can go further. And Dempster is certainly an unusual, highly unusual name. The name of the 4th son does not fit into the usual naming pattern, and it alerts us to be on the lookout for other names. That could be a last name being used here. It could be a maiden name used as a first name, but be careful, that's not always the case. We can use it as a valuable clue to connect this James with other Beattys. And I did that because it was really the clue that was the linchpin that helped me to solve the problem. Because when I started looking at Dempsters and Beattys in the same parishes in Ireland, and I found this record from the 18th century from a voting list, I see Robert Beatty and William Beatty and Thomas Beatty and David Dempster all in the same parish in Donaghcloney in County Down. And that turns out to be the place where James moved from when he moved down to County Wexford. And Robert, William, and Thomas were likely his brothers. And we find, for example, an earlier will, this is from the 1740s, of a James Beatty leaving a will, and Samuel Dempster and Marmaduke Dempster being the witnesses. So another evidence that these families were very close together and were witnessing each other's documents. I actually found David Dempster's will having Beattys, and there were Beattys witnessing it. And then in the mill accounts in the Irish House of Commons records, there are records of David Dempster, the same one on that voters list, owning a mill at Newtown Barry, and then my ancestor down below there, James Beatty, having a mill at Ballycanoe. So that was all those clues, those threads tying together, allowed me to help break through the evidence and really help place my family. So using these kinds of clues, like these kinds of names, can be really, really very helpful in pulling these families together. Okay, middle names were rare in the British Isles and America until the last quarter of the 18th century. The exception would be Germans in America, who had middle names at a much earlier date, but we will address that later. Among British descended people, middle names began to appear after 1775 and became increasingly popular by 1820. 5% of people had middle names in 1775. In England, 70% had them by 1820. It can be very difficult to find documentary evidence of a middle name. You will find records of people using a middle initial in records, but very rarely is the full name ever written out, especially if they are not of Germanic background. Family Bibles, church records, and tombstones are probably the best sources, but even then, the name may not be written out. It may just be written as an initial. The earliest middle names were often surnames, earlier ancestors, or close relatives, so it can be a valuable clue if you can find evidence of a full middle name of an ancestor. A son may have two names, one for each of his grandfathers, especially after the old naming custom had disappeared. Later on, these names, middle names, can be really helpful as clues, and I'll show you another example out of my family history. This is a family named Isaac Beasley and his wife Srepta McMillan. They lived in Clark County, Ohio, and they have a family Bible, which we have here, that we see Mary Elizabeth, Liza Ann, William, Jane G., and Rachel P. As middle names. They weren't written out. What clues can we gain from this, and what were the names of Srepta's parents? Unfortunately, we have only one boy here to look at, and we wish we had another son that might be the other father, but we do find, as we do a little studying here, that William was the name of Isaac's father, so the only son was named after the father's father. We do know that the eldest daughter had a middle name Elizabeth, but the first name Mary, and Mary is not a name that's found in the Beasley family at all. So it gives us a clue that it may be from Srepta's side of the family rather than the Beasley side. We look at all the brothers and sisters of Isaac Beasley, and we find that there was a sister named Jane who married Hezekiah Graham, and another sister named Rachel who married James Payden. Well, there was a Jane G and a Rachel P among the children in the Bible. So we can assume that maybe her name was Jane Graham and the other daughter was Rachel Payden after these two married sisters. Just a clue, but the Bible gives us just a little bit of a tantalizing clue there, but that's the sort of thing that we want to explore when we find middle initials like that in a Bible. Returning to the Bible record, we see that Eliza was actually used again for the second daughter, and so we don't know about Mary. That becomes very important because it turns out that isn't probably very likely the name of Srepta's mother from other evidence. And chase down the clue can be really complicated, and I won't go into it in great depth, but her father's name was Samson. They were from Virginia. No marriage record for Samson and his first wife exists. There were several siblings of Srepta we find from the marriage records, and the death record of a brother shows Mary as his mother. So we still don't know her maiden name, but Mary emerges as the likely mother's name when there are no other marriage records or other records to use. So when you're in this kind of situation, you want to make sure you glean as many clues as you can, especially when you have a family Bible to work with. Okay, in early New England, we already discussed the strong preference for biblical names among the Puritans. I want to focus briefly on some variants of naming patterns that were present in colonial America. There have been a number of studies done to analyze the names used in early populations. A study of names from Hingham, Massachusetts before 1735 showed that 74% firstborn daughters were named after their mothers and 67% were named after their fathers. So that means that grandparent naming system may not have been in play in New England the same way that it was, say, in Virginia or Pennsylvania or other areas there. So beware of that. You can't really project Hingham, this one study, on all of New England, but it's one study that has been done that an historian used to look at those names. Godparents were not allowed in New England, so you'll not find them in the church record. So that was not in play there. But it does show a break in the old world custom of naming children after grandparents and godparents. The use of virtue names, which I alluded to earlier, was especially popular among Quakers and among Puritans. You should also make note of the fact that the birth order and circumstances of a birth may dictate the naming of a child. So choosing a name that represents an idea like charity, thankful, patience, prudence, fear, resolved. You'll see those kinds of names often in the Quaker, or not, well, in Quaker too, but mostly very often in the Puritan records. Special names such as Benoni may indicate sorrow and may have been used when a mother died in childbirth. So if you see a Benoni in your family, that's a clue there that there might be something going on, like a death. Benjamin was often used as the name of a youngest son because the biblical Benjamin is the youngest son of Jacob. So again, there may be a birth order element in play for a particular name. Let's go here. Among other early names, as I mentioned, the study of Middlesex County, Virginia, from the period 1650 to 1750. Historians have looked at this particular county. I don't know what they used particularly because that's a burned county and a lot of records are lost, but just over 71% of firstborn boys were named after either their fathers or their grandfathers, 17.8% for their uncles, 63.8% of second sons were named after their father or grandfathers, 23.3% for uncles, 1.3% for deceased siblings. 33.7% of third-born sons were named after their fathers or grandfathers, 30.6% for uncles, 8.2% for deceased siblings. 65.5% of eldest daughters were named after their mothers and grandmothers, 58.5% for the same for mothers and grandmothers, 29% for the mother or grandmother. So you can see just from these numbers, these statistics, is that in Virginia, the grandparent system was much more in play than it was in New England. So keep that in mind when you're looking for naming patterns as clues. That you may not be able to apply it to the New England model as well as you can to the Virginia model. The Quaker naming pattern was just the reverse and just very different from the traditional naming pattern. Instead of the firstborn son being named after the father's father, it was oftentimes the mother's father, and then the second son for the father's father, third son for the father, first daughter for the father's mother, second daughter for the mother's mother, third daughter for the mother. Quakers did not practice baptism, so names were not assigned as part of that ritual. Names of children were nominated by parents, witnessed by neighbors, and then solemnly entered into the minutes of the meeting. So that's how they were registered. Coming to America often brought about a lot of new customs. It's an influential factor. Many in the colonial period, many immigrant groups continued to maintain the same naming customs in the old world, but after the Revolutionary War, as American society began to develop its own unique identity and change more rapidly away from Europe, it became more quote unquote American. There was its own culture, and so by that time, certainly in the mid 19th century, many immigrants were eager to become Americanized, and so the old world customs were often discarded. Moving to a new country meant adopting all of the new customs and styles and giving up the old ways, the diet, the customs, the language. And the whole new set of customs were like this. Immigration to America brought, as I said, new customs, changing in tastes, a desire to be fashionable, a desire for the children to blend in with other children, a desire to honor political, religious, and military heroes became very important. Also, the changing roles of husbands and wives was important. And I didn't really allude to this earlier, but in the 17th century and even earlier, the man of the house that was the patriarch, and the children were expected to be obedient to that person, and it was often he who chose the names of children. But by the 19th century, that patriarchal custom began to break down, and husbands and wives began to have dual roles in naming children. So it wasn't quite as the same way as that existed in the past. Religious figures were very popular choices for the names of children. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, was very popular among Protestants, especially among Methodists. So when you see John W. Or Wesley among the names of the children, it might be a clue that the family was Methodist, not always. Lorenzo Dow, born in Connecticut, was also a founding Methodist leader, as was Francis Asbury. So sometimes you'll see Lorenzo D. and Francis A. among the names of children among Protestant families, very popular. George Whitefield was the Billy Graham of his day, a very popular orator, an early convert to Methodism. He preached to large crowds and was very popular. So you'll see a lot of George W's. You may be thinking that George Washington could be, but it could be if you're pre-George Washington, it may be George Whitefield. That is the person that's of interest here. Certainly among political names, the very popular ones would be George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Daniel Webster. But you'll see Henry Clay, and you'll see a variety of other people too. You'll see Robert E. Lee, Robert Lee. You'll see Jefferson Davis, Jefferson D. All of these will be names that show up in families in the 19th century as political heroes. And certainly military heroes that were popular from the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 era would be Oliver Hazard Perry, Francis Marion, and William Henry Harrison. So you'll see these names very popular among Protestant families in the early 19th century in America. I touched on the fact that patriarchy had declined, but for Catholics and for some other cultural groups, the priest or clergyman was often given the task of naming the child, and they would often choose a saint's name or a religious person for the child. There may have been even situations where a family came to church to name a child a certain name, and the priest refused to name the child that name because it was not a religious name. It had to have a religious name for the priest to perform the sacrament. So that might be a clue or a case that happened, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward. The child had to have approved name of a saint in order to be named. So in esoteric names and names among like last names, you would not find that in a Catholic family, but you would find it much more commonly in a Protestant family. Other idea is a name as a talisman, or names that were chosen for popular fashion rather than family history. Certain names were seen as having power behind them. The belief came to be that if you give a certain name to a child, the power within that name will be imbued into the child. The name comes to have the names have a mystical quality to them that has nothing to do with the family history or tradition at all. And there are all kinds of books came out in the 19th century. We still have them today, and they're still popular, that give names to babies that you can read and choose a name that you like for the name of a child. I even read a story the other day about a lady who has a business in New York City, and her job is to people go to her and pay her money to choose and come up with a selection of names for the baby. And so that there are a lot of these like this cool names for babies, the Penguin Book of Baby Names, Name Your Baby's Destiny, or Zodiac baby names. Again, family history and tradition has vanished here. It's all about what's popular, what will impact the destiny of the young child going forward. The need for choosing exactly the right name requires extensive research into meanings. And some of these books appear this way. There are actually also books on Jewish names and Irish names that people can choose a name for a child. Hollywood, of course, has also had a big impact on names. Lena, Clark, Doris, Elizabeth, Humphrey, Judy. I've not heard Yule being used, but Hal, Hattie. These are all popular stars of the 1930s and 40s. They were certainly influential. You might remember the movie Splash that came out in 1984. It was starred Daryl Hannah as a mermaid, and Tom Hanks was her love interest. And prior to that movie, you never saw the name Madison being used for a girl's name. It was a rare name, very rare name. But in the movie, the character of Daryl Hannah chooses her own name by seeing a sign for Madison Avenue, so she becomes Madison. Well, what happened after that is that in the 1980s and 1990s, Madison became a very popular girl's name, and it really traces its roots back to Splash when it came out. So those are the sorts of things that will play out years later, and when these Madisons are 80 and 90 years old, well into the future, they'll look back and say, well, why did we choose Granny's name like this? And it goes back to this movie. African American naming customs are also very much in play in British and Isles and in America. African names and sometimes slave names fall into the following categories. Events surrounding the birth of the child, such as Iodel, joy has come to the home. Emotional warnings, such as Nahamo, which means misfortune, in Zimbabwe, celebrity culture, order of the child's birth, especially in the case of twins, day-born names based on the day of the week that the child was born, faith-based names based on African, not Christian culture, day, night, or season of the birth, ancestral names or the names of senior members of a clan, and nicknames. Those are all in play when you're studying African American names. In slavery times, it was often common that the slave owner would choose the names of a child, and that's why you begin to see a lot of classical sounding names like Caesar and Plato and Apollo and names like that that were used as kind of an amusement for their owners. Certain African names were preserved as slave names, but they are a rarity. Naming custom of the day of the week on which a child was born survived in some slave cultures. Kujo, Mingo, and Kofi and Kwame are all examples of day names that derive from the culture of the Akan people in what is now Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Togo. Some African children were also given names based on the circumstances of their birth as to whether the father acknowledged the baby, whether the father was living or dead, whether the birth came after a long period of childlessness. African names tended to be those in those slave cultures most isolated from European influences, especially the islands off of Georgia and South Carolina. African names were also more popular among slaves and freedmen in the North than they were in the South, since they enjoyed more freedom to name their children in the North. As slaves became Christianized, it was also popular and customary for them to receive biblical names. After slavery in modern times, especially in the second half of the 20th century, modern African Americans have wanted to distance themselves from their slavery roots and instead embrace cultural traditions that are not European in origin. And the naming of children certainly reflects this trend. As with whites, blacks have an interest in popular culture and in celebrities who are prominent with African Americans. Such celebrity names have influenced the naming of children. Some blacks have turned to Islam and have chosen names like Muhammad, Aisha, and Aliyah as names. Some parents have gravitated towards African names or Afrocentric names, and names that are out of the African tradition. French names such as Monique, Andre, and Antoine have become more popular in the 20th century than non-French names among whites. Traditional European and biblical names appear, but not with the same frequency as they did earlier in the 19th century, for example. Finally, there's a strong tradition of inventive names among African Americans, such as Lakeisha and Deshawn and Jamarcus and Shaniqua, all of which are non-European. The practice involves adding several different prefixes to one of several suffixes, like le and la, ja and je, da and de, ra and re. And suffixes were usually not used. That gives you an idea of what was going on. These were adding prefixes and suffixes to a variety of roots to make an Afro or Afrocentric sound. Finally, or I should say European names, we've looked at British Isles here, but I want to turn now to names from the continent of Europe. These customs certainly influenced immigrants to Europe in the earliest generations, but many immigrants, as I said earlier, dropped many European customs once they reached American soil. Still, we need to understand the naming patterns and customs of the countries of our ancestors in order to understand them better. Unlike the Scots-Irish, those patterns may or may not give us clues as to parents. Let's talk about Germany. Germany is a complex entity made up of many different states, each with very different sets of customs and cultural traditions. Until German unification in 1871, each state was a separate country with distinctive dialects and traditions. Thus, it is not surprising that naming customs vary greatly within the German Empire, depending on the region and on the religion of the parents. We're going to talk about several of these in more detail. Some parts of Germany practiced patronymic naming systems where the first name of the father became the last name of the son. In Catholic areas of Germany, it was popular to name children according to what were termed naming days, usually a set of days surrounding a feast day of a particular saint, while papal names were also popular. Some Germans, especially in Lutheran areas, like to name children after Old Testament patriarchs or religious reformers. Latin and Greek first names were also popular, as were the names of Germanic emperors and kings. Naming children after godparents was a very common practice, both in Germany and among Germans in America. In some cases, the godparent would actually name the baptized child. Another custom was called Rufnamen. Boys would all receive the first name of Johann, and all girls would be given the first name Maria or Anna. Then each would receive a different, distinct middle name, and they would be known by that middle name. Among Germans, middle names were more common at a much earlier date. Initials were usually not used. In other parts of Germany, two names used together were considered one name and sometimes were hyphenated. In modern Germany, especially before unification, there was a trend among some classes of Germans to give children Anglo-sounding names like Kevin, Mandy, Peggy, and Chantal. Researchers found that children with these names were assumed to come from a lower socioeconomic backgrounds and were thus discriminated against in schools as having lower performance and behavior problems. This phenomenon is known as Kevinism. Kind of interesting. Let's talk first about the patronymical naming system, and I want to show you an example here. This is popular in Scandinavia, as well as even in the Orkney Isles of Scotland. And it goes back to the Vikings in some ways, I suppose. This system does not dictate how children receive their names, but it does determine their surname. Essentially, the first name of the father becomes the last name of the son. In this example, Lawrence Garthson named his son Garth. Since his father's name was Lawrence, he takes the name Lawrence's. If Garth has a son Theodore, he will have the name Garth's. Then his son William Magnus has the name Theodore's son. Be aware of this naming system because it will play out in different ways in Dutch records, which we'll talk about in a moment. If your German ancestors were Catholics, especially in Bavaria and Baden and Württemberg, they likely followed a custom of naming children after saints. Feast days are common. In the days leading up to and after a feast, it is common to name a child after a saint, since it was believed that the saint would bestow a special protection on that child. These were designated as official naming days when people were encouraged to honor specific saints in the naming of their children. If you suspect your family may have followed this custom, you should locate the Catholic Church registers for your family and glean the baptismal records of all the children. You will want to find that in certain parts of Germany, you will find that certain regional saints have particular popularity since their relics may be located in a local church. A disproportionate number of children and generations of a family may have the names of those particular saints in particular. One of my great-grandfathers came from a part of Bavaria where Saint Ursula was a popular saint. Her relics were housed in the local church, and so many local children have the name Ursula, which may not be popular in other parts of Germany or even in Bavaria. A good book on this topic, and it should be on your bibliography, is by Shirley Reamer and Roger Meinert and Jennifer Anderson. It's called German Research Companion, and there's a whole section in this about German name days or Namenstage in German-speaking world, and it goes through the whole calendar of the Catholic Church and the particular saints that are associated with those names. I suspect the calendar is even more complex than this, and there are a lot more lesser saints in here that are not listed. So here's an example of my great-grandfather, Johann Baptist. Knoll was his name. He was born on June 26, 1869, and the feast day for St. John the Baptist is June the 24th. So he was born within this naming day period of time when children were named after the prevailing saint, in this case, John the Baptist. And then it comes right out in the Catholic Church record. But if we look at all the children that this family had, the pattern isn't always as strong as what we might hope. The eldest son, Joseph, was certainly born in March at the time of St. Joseph's feast, Anton for St. Anthony's feast, Andreas for St. Andrew's feast, and Johann Baptist for St. John the Baptist's feast, and Victoria for St. Victoria's feast. But when we get to, and Mary for St. Mary, the Virgin's feast on July 6th. But when we get to Josepha, the later daughter, there's no feminized version of Joseph. There's no feast. It's a feminized version of Joseph. nothing there at play. And Saint Wendelin, a popular name, but was born in April, but that's certainly an October feast, so that doesn't play out. And for Franz Xavier, his feast is December, and there's a child born in June. So it doesn't always line up, but it certainly did for the first 6 or 7 children that the family had. Note that the mother's parents, Kunigunde, her parents, Philip and Walburga, were not named among any of the children that they had, even though they were the maternal grandparents. So you cannot use the Catholic family like this to look for naming clues for parents, because the feasts were much more important than were the grandparents in this case. Be aware that that these Catholic Church records were taken in Latin, and so the priests wrote the names out in Latin. So Carl may be written as Carlus, Ludovicus would be Louis or Ludwig, and so forth. The names may not be the name that you see in the parish register, may not be the actual name that the person went by. They were Latinized for the benefit of the records. Also be aware that once a family came to America, the Germans could easily Americanize or Anglicize a name from Germany. So Wilhelm became William, Johann became John, Carl became Charles, and so on. So that's be aware of that when you're looking at German records. Here's an example of the roof names I was talking about, and this is from the 18th century in a town in Rhineland-Pfalz. This is from the town of Sprendingen. These are all ancestors this is an ancestral family of mine, Johann Conrad Nepper and his wife Anna Katharina Bernhardt. And they had these children. You notice they had 3 sons, Johann Heinrich, Johann Nikolaus, Johann Heinrich again, because the other one died young, and then an Anna Christina and Anna Maria. So they both had that same first name, but they were all those names. The child would have been named for the middle name, not for the first name. But then Paul comes along, and he was born in Pennsylvania, not in Germany, and he doesn't seem to have the Johann Paul. This is not written that way in the church record. It's just Paul. So clearly, once they'd come to America, the roof naming custom had broken down, and they began to name children without the common first name. So that can be in play when you're looking at records. Here's another example I want to show you about godparents' names. This is a German church record from here in Allen County, Indiana, St. Peter's Lutheran Church. And you'll notice the children, there's a child born at the top there, Heinrich Friedrich Wilhelm. And you'll notice that among the children, which I've underlined, they're the godparents, Taufzeugen. There's a Wilhelm Schaefer and a Friedrich Thiele, who are among the godparents. And so the child has the middle names, has the first name Heinrich, the second name Friedrich, the third name Wilhelm. So that first name, he probably was never known under Heinrich. He's probably either known by Friedrich or Wilhelm, which are the names of the 2 godfathers. And for the daughter, for the girl below that, there's an Anna Maria Sophia. She's the legitimate daughter of Rudolph and his wife Wilhelmina. But look at the godparents again. There's a Mrs. Maria Elizabeth, who's a godparent, and a Mrs. Sophia, who's also a godmother. And so you see the middle names there, Maria Sophia, that reflect the influence of the 2 godmothers on the naming choice. They probably jointly named the child. So the child probably went by either Maria or Sophia, not by Anna. So if you're dealing with a Missouri Synod German family in America, be aware of this custom, because the godparents were very important in the naming of a child. Okay, the systems in France and Switzerland are presently governed by very specific rules. Only names from approved lists may be used. No last names can be used as first names. No names that will harm the child. No biblical villains like Judas or Cain. No brand names can be used as first names. No place names can be used as first names. No giving a boy a girl's name or a girl a boy's name. And no making up of a new name. So they're very strict rules that they have that are still in place, but that prevents a child being named Adolf Hitler Dubois or something like that, because it's a villain name, and that name would be considered to be to harm the child. So it's absolutely forbidden. In Switzerland, the naming the eldest child for the father's father and the eldest daughter for the mother's mother was sometimes allowed, but it was not strong enough for us to look at as a regular pattern. Sometimes it exists, but not always. Equally popular was giving the child the name of one of the two godparents of that child's sex. Very small number of Christian names were used in some local variants. And so it gets really boring when you're looking at Swiss records to see the same names used over and over and over again. Sometimes ministers chose the name and used a version of the name according to slang. So example, Magdalena may be Madlena. And it's difficult to know which version the child used, but I have found in looking at Swiss records, I've done a lot of Swiss research, that the name that appears in a baptismal record, like if it's Madlena, that she'll appear that way later on her marriage record, and it won't be Magdalena. I've seen exceptions to that, but be aware of the variant of the name that if you find a marriage record, if you're going back to look for her baptism, because very often that same variant will be in use. Combining two names into a single name will happen. They'll see like Hans Uli, where it's usually Hans and Uli are two different names and they're combined. Use of necronyms are also very popular. If a child dies, a later child will often be given that name. And sometimes I have seen this is really puzzling, but if a father will have two children of the same name, usually with two different mothers, born at a great distance from each other. So if a person had a number of children with a wife, she dies, he marries a much younger woman, has a bunch more children, you will sometimes find two children with the same name, two Hanses or two Christians or whatever. And then until I knew that, it was always a thing that I looked at saying, well, that can't be the same person because there's a child with the same name. But that's not the case. And it's allowed me to look at these records a little bit differently because they did often name two children with the same name, especially if there are two different mothers involved here. Spanish names, they use the same name. They're also very heavily used by the Roman Catholic feast day calendar for the names of children, like in Catholic Germany. The use of traditional Spanish names are also in play. Under the Franco regime and earlier, there were restrictions on approved names. Modern Spaniards, however, can give a child any name so long it is not deemed injurious. Nicknames are often official. Nicknames as official names are not permitted. They're considered too colloquial and never permitted in formal address. Composite forenames are common and considered as one name. So you'll see Jose Maria to be a boy, even though the Maria name is considered a girl's name. In this case, it's invoking the Virgin Mary. And so you'll see that name being used as a middle name for a boy. In some cases, you'll also see that in Germany occasionally. Now, here's the Dutch naming system that was in place in early New Netherlands, which is the time when the Dutch ruled New York before the English came. You'll find Dutch records in place there, and you'll find this kind of pattern in place. The first son for the father's mother, the second son for the mother's mother, the first daughter for the father's mother, the second daughter for the mother's mother. The use of necronyms is very popular. If a child died, the next child would often have that same name. If the father died when the mother was pregnant, if a boy, he would be given the name for the father. Likewise, if the mother died in childbirth and the daughter survived, that it would be named for her. Subsequent children were often named for aunts and uncles. Now, you have to be aware of the patronymic system used as middle names in these Dutch names, and it can be a very complicated talk. This could be a whole talk in and of itself. I'm just going to touch on it here, but when you have a name like Cornelius or Cornelius, he'll often have as his middle name his father's first name woven into the name. So in this case, we have Cornelius Antonissen van Slyke, which means he's from Slyke, and Cornelius Anton's son from Slyke. But below it, you'll see Cornelius Tunissen. Tunis is a nickname for Anthony. Cornelius Antonissen van Breukelen, which is Brooklyn in New York. Cornelius van Brooklyn, Cornelius of Brooklyn, Cornelius Antonissen van Slicht, and Cornelius Tunissen van Slicht. The interesting thing is that all 6 versions of the name all refer to the same person in various records. So it shows you that it can be very complicated when you're getting into these early Dutch records. You can get clues to the father's first name and sometimes clues to the town in the Netherlands where the family may have come from. In this case, Slijk or Slicht, but they can be very complicated to use and difficult. Scandinavian customs: first son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, later sons after the grandfathers or uncles, first daughter for the father's mother, second daughter for the mother's mother, later daughters for great grandmothers or aunts. The exception is naming a daughter from a second marriage after a deceased wife from the first marriage. They like to do that. So if a first wife died and the father remarries, expect a daughter to have that name of that first wife. Jewish names: Ashkenazi Jews believed in naming children after ancestors, but never after a living forebear. In posthumous births, when the father died, a son would often be given the name of his father. In the Sephardic Jewish custom, the eldest son would be named for the father's father, the second son for the mother's father, the third son for the paternal great-grandfather. Here's another quick case study. I know we're about running out of time here, but this is a German-Dutch family. A book says that a woman named Phebe Throckmorton was the daughter of Daniel Throckmorton, and perhaps his wife Mary Barkalow. The will of Cornelius Barkalow, however, names a bequest to his daughter Phebe, the wife of William Beam. Cornelius had previously been married to a Janet G. Amick. So the proof would seem to be with Cornelius, but what do the names of William and Phoebe's children seem to suggest? So we have a family here that lived in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Ohio. These are ancestors of my wife. And William Beam and his wife Phebe have the following children: Jane, John, Isaac, Mary, Isabel, Cornelius, Phoebe, James, and Asa. So Phoebe's parents, it turns out, are Cornelius Barkalow and his wife Janetchi, or Jane, based on the will and the naming patterns of the children. We have DNA also that backs this up. There could have been a son, Daniel, who died, but no naming pattern is directly apparent here. But we do know that the DNA and then the will and so forth of Cornelius proves that Cornelius was the father, but it does not certainly come as the first son, the second son, or even the third son. It comes further down in the list of children, but it's still an important clue. So you have to look for that as a possibility. And sometimes the names and looking at the names can help you discern when you have conflicting evidence. So I want to close here by giving some advice. When you're doing family research, you want to look at the names of all the children of the ancestral couple, if possible. Get as much as you possibly can from all the sources available: census records, church records if they're available, family Bibles. Use wills, deeds, cemetery records, census, vital records, etc. You may not be able to find all, since some may have died young without any record of their ever living. Identify the birth order if possible. Sometimes the order of children's names in a will or a probate file will be their birth order. Or sometimes they'll list all the sons first and all the daughters second, but the names of those girls and boys will be in birth order within that umbrella. Having the full family may, but not always, help identify earlier generations. But knowing the ancestral naming culture is what's really most important. And that's where you need to read about the culture of the family and read what you can about what was going on at the time and where they were living and what was the prevailing custom at the time.